Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The sun was already casting golden rays across the suburban street as I sat in the car, engine off, my eyes trained on the house that once felt like my safe haven. Inside, the life I'd built with Molly over the past 5 years ticked on as if nothing had changed. The neighborhood stirred awake around me, children on bicycles weaving past, their laughter punctuating the early morning calm. It was a stark contrast to the storm inside my chest. I replayed last night's conversation for the 100th time, dissecting every word, every strained pause. Her voice, the way it trembled just slightly as she spoke, haunted me. "Billy, there's something I need to say." Molly stood in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. She ran a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture that had become all too familiar in the past few months. I watched her eyes, searching for a clue, some flicker of remorse. But instead, they held a detached kind of resolve. I swallowed hard, the metallic taste of dread sharp on my tongue. "Go on," I said, my voice calm, betraying none of the churning inside me. "I'm not sure how to explain this." She took a shaky breath. "I love you, Billy. I do. But something's missing. I need space, a chance to figure out who I am." Her words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last. I didn't flinch. Years of corporate negotiations had taught me to hold my composure, to absorb the shock without crumbling. But this wasn't a boardroom, and Molly wasn't an opponent. She was my wife, the woman I'd built dreams with, shared laughter and fights, 1,000 moments that now seemed poised to slip through my fingers. "Space," I repeated, the word foreign and bitter. "And Nick?" She winced, just for a moment, but it was enough. The confirmation I dreaded, that hollow feeling in my gut I'd ignored for too long, solidified into a reality I couldn't deny. "It's not what you think," she rushed to say, stepping closer. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, a scent that once calmed me but now made my skin crawl. He's part of why I'm confused." I nodded slowly, a gesture that masked the anger flaring beneath my surface. "Part of it," I echoed, my voice tighter now. The room felt smaller, the air too thin. I took a step back, putting distance between us, needing space of my own to breathe. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Molly's gaze darted to the floor, unable to hold mine. The quiet admission sliced deeper than any shouted accusation ever could. I turned away, unable to face her. Instead, I stared out the window at the dark street, the street lamps casting their amber glow across our lawn. It looked peaceful out there, untouched by the chaos inside. I wished, absurdly, that I could step out and let the night air wash this all away. "Billy, please. Say something." Her voice cracked, the tremor in it tugging at the part of me that still wanted to reach out, to comfort her despite it all. But I couldn't. Not now. I heard the clock tick, each second louder than the last. Finally, I spoke, keeping my back to her. "You need space. Take it. But don't expect me to wait here for you to figure out what you want." The room fell silent, save for the rhythmic ticking that now seemed to echo in my chest. I didn't move until I heard her footsteps retreat, the creak of the stairs as she climbed to our bedroom. Our bedroom. The place where laughter and whispered dreams once lived. When the door clicked shut, I sank into a chair at the dining table. The house was dark, the moon casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. I traced the patterns absent-mindedly, a futile attempt to anchor myself in the familiar. But it didn't work. Everything felt foreign now. Morning came, as it always does, relentless and bright. The silence that greeted me as I stood at the foot of the stairs was different, a harbinger of the fracture in our life. I knew then that I couldn't just sit back and let this story play out on her terms. If Molly wanted space, if she thought she could straddle two worlds while I waited in quiet agony, she was mistaken. As I slipped my keys into my pocket and walked out the front door, I decided I wouldn't be a passive spectator in my own life. I had a role to play, and it was time I wrote my own script. I spent the morning in a daze, my body going through the motions while my mind replayed fragments of conversations, glances, half-smiles that suddenly made sense under this new, harsh light. Nick, with his perfect teeth and casual charm, had wormed his way into my life under the guise of being a harmless colleague. I clenched the steering wheel as I remembered the first time Molly mentioned him. Just another name at her firm, one I'd dismissed like countless others. Now, it burned in my mind like a brand. Pulling into the parking lot at work, I felt the shift in myself solidify into something colder. I had always been a planner, a strategist. In business, no problem was insurmountable with the right approach. Why should this be any different? I was done ignoring the signs, done pretending that things would sort themselves out. This time, I would be prepared. Even if it meant stepping into a role I'd never imagined for myself. The office was quiet, a rare respite in the fast-paced world of marketing where deadlines raced and clients' demands turned day into night. The usual hum of phones and the tap of keyboards were replaced by the soft whir of the building's HVAC system. I stared at the emails piling up on my screen, their subject lines blurring together in a mess of obligations. None of it registered, my thoughts were still tangled in the events of the morning. It was only when my coworker, Rachel, poked her head into my office that I realized I hadn't moved in over an hour. She raised an eyebrow, half hidden behind her thick, red-framed glasses. "Billy, you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." A forced smile cracked my otherwise stoic expression. "Just a rough morning, Rachel. Nothing a strong coffee can't fix." She nodded, but her eyes lingered a moment longer, searching for something unspoken. Rachel was sharp, too observant for her own good sometimes. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me. I'm just down the hall." I nodded and watched as she disappeared back into the maze of cubicles. The moment the door clicked shut, the weight on my chest returned. The space was suffocating, the air too thick. I needed a break from these walls, from the desk that felt like it had become part of me after years of relentless work. The cafeteria was a sanctuary only in name. I grabbed a paper cup and filled it with the coffee that had the consistency of tar but promised a bitter reprieve. Leaning against the counter, I stared at the ground swirling in my cup. It was almost poetic how the mess mirrored my life, chaotic and dark. "Long day already?" The voice came from behind me, smooth and familiar. "Nick." I didn't turn around immediately. My pulse quickened, fists tightening around the cup. When I finally faced him, he was smiling, that easy, affable grin that once seemed harmless but now taunted me. He had the look of someone who knew his way around attention, dark hair swept effortlessly to the side, sleeves rolled up to reveal just a hint of muscled forearms. Confidence oozed from every gesture. "Nick," I said, keeping my tone even. "You could say that." He nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my gaze. "I hear you, man. This place has been a madhouse lately. You and Molly should come out with the team Friday night. A little unwinding could do everyone good." The mention of her name, spoken so casually by him, twisted like a knife. I could feel the burn creeping up my neck, but I forced a smile. "We'll see," I replied, voice tight. Nick's eyes flickered, catching something in my expression that made his smile falter for just a fraction of a second. But then he was off, chattering with another coworker who entered the room, his laughter ringing out like nails on a chalkboard. I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath, and left the cafeteria without another word. My heart pounded as I walked back to my office, the bitter taste of rage coating my throat. I couldn't go on like this, existing on the edge, piecing together moments of betrayal like some twisted puzzle. I needed answers. At home that evening, the silence was almost oppressive. Molly was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, as if nothing had changed. The sight of her there, so serene, felt surreal. The woman I loved, the same one who had kissed me goodnight thousands of times, was now a stranger wrapped in familiar skin. I sat down across from her, the creak of the chair cutting through the silence. She glanced up, eyes questioning, but didn't say a word. "We need to talk," I said finally. The words were heavy, dragging each syllable through the room. Molly closed her book, marking the page with one delicate finger, and met my eyes. "I know," she replied, voice barely a whisper. The seconds that followed felt like hours, each one stretching out until the air was thick with things unsaid. She was the first to break the silence. "Billy, I meant it when I said this isn't about us not working. It's about me, about needing to find out who I am outside of this." I clenched my jaw. "Outside of this?" I repeated, gesturing around at our home, the photos on the walls that chronicled years of love and life. "Molly, everything we've built, everything we've shared, it's not enough." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I wanted to cross the room, to take her hands and reassure her, even though she was the one who had brought this storm into our lives. But I stayed rooted to my chair. The distance between us felt too wide, a chasm carved by secrets and guilt. "I'm not asking for this to be easy," she said. "I just need you to trust that it will be worth it. That I'll come back to you." I looked at her, truly looked, and saw the shadow of the woman I married behind eyes that now belonged to someone else. "I can't make you stay, Molly. But don't expect me to wait while you decide where your heart lies." The words hung there, raw and exposed. She nodded slowly, as if she had already prepared herself for this moment, already accepted what it meant. The rest of the evening passed in painful silence. I lay in bed, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards as she moved around downstairs. Each sound was a reminder that this was real, that my life was splintering and there was no going back. But as the hours dragged on, anger gave way to clarity. Molly might have been the one who set this fire, but I wasn't going to let it consume me. She wanted space, she wanted answers. I would find my own. And in the process, I would make sure she understood that betrayal has its consequences. Somewhere in the depths of that sleepless night, a plan began to form. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch my life unravel. If Molly wanted to play games, I would make sure I knew all the rules. And when the time came, I would be ready to play my part. The weekend felt like an eternity. Molly's movements around the house were muted, almost ghostly, as if she were afraid to disturb whatever fragile truce we were holding on to. The sun streamed through the blinds, cutting across the floor in jagged stripes, but the light did nothing to dispel the dark cloud that had settled over us. By Sunday evening, the pretense of normalcy was too much to bear. I took my car keys and left, letting the heavy thud of the front door punctuate my departure. The streets were quiet, lined with houses where other families probably sat down to dinner or watched TV together, oblivious to the battles being fought behind other doors. I drove aimlessly, the radio off, the silence only broken by the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. Eventually, I found myself parked in the lot of a small bar I'd frequented years ago, a dimly lit place with sticky floors and an old jukebox that played everything from Hank Williams to the Rolling Stones. It was just as I remembered, the same neon signs buzzing weakly, the same weathered bartender wiping down the counter with a rag that looked as worn out as he did. I slid onto a stool, nodding to the bartender as he set a whiskey in front of me without a word. I sipped slowly, the burn steadying my nerves. The few other patrons were scattered across the room, lost in their own conversations or staring blankly at the TV mounted above the bar. I found comfort in their indifference. I was nursing my second glass when a voice interrupted my brooding. "Mind if I sit?" I glanced up and found Rachel standing there, a thin smile on her lips. The surprise must have shown on my face because she chuckled softly. "Small world, huh?" "Yeah," I said, gesturing to the stool next to mine. "Go ahead." She ordered a drink and turned to face me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to piece together the story she knew I wasn't sharing at work. You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world lately, Billy. Is everything okay? I looked down at my drink, swirling it absently. The urge to spill everything, to lay bare the betrayal that had consumed my life, gnawed at me. But I hesitated. Instead, I offered a vague smile. Just a rough patch. Rachel's gaze softened, and for a moment, I saw genuine concern there. If you ever need to talk, I'm a good listener. Just putting that out there. I nodded, grateful for the offer but unwilling to drag her into my mess. Thanks, Rachel. I'll keep that in mind. We sat in companionable silence for a while, exchanging small talk that felt almost therapeutic. The noise of the bar and the familiarity of an old friend dulled the sharp edges of my thoughts. But as the hour grew late, reality came crashing back. Molly was home, waiting. Or maybe not waiting at all. The thought sent a jolt of bitterness through me. Rachel glanced at her watch, then back at me. I should probably head out. Early meeting tomorrow. Yeah, me too, I said, even though the idea of facing work, facing Nick, made my stomach twist. She smiled and left, her silhouette framed briefly in the neon glow before disappearing into the night. I finished my drink, paid the tab, and walked back to my car, the chill of the night air biting through my thin jacket. As I sat behind the wheel, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from Molly. Are you okay? I noticed you were gone. A wave of conflicting emotions surged through me, anger, sadness, something almost like longing. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned the key in the ignition and drove home, the road a blur beneath me. When I stepped inside, the house was dark except for the dim glow of the kitchen light. Molly was sitting at the table, a mug cradled in her hands. She looked up, eyes weary but relieved. You're back. I nodded and walked past her to the living room, dropping onto the couch. The silence stretched again, tighter this time, until she broke it. I was worried, she said softly, standing in the doorway, her figure outlined by the faint light. Where did you go? Out, I replied, the word curt and final. She flinched but didn't move. Billy, we can't keep doing this. The silence, the distance, it's tearing us apart. I turned to face her, the fatigue in my bones giving way to a simmering anger. You think silence is what's tearing us apart? It's not the silence, Molly. It's the lies. It's the fact that I have to sit here and wonder where your head is when you're with me, or if it's somewhere else entirely. Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward. I told you I need time. I need to figure out. To figure out what? I interrupted, my voice rising. Whether you want me or him. Whether this life we built is worth it. I can't be the backup plan, Molly. I won't. Her lips quivered as she tried to find the words, but none came. The silence that followed was different, cold, final. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, I said, standing up. I didn't wait for her reply as I walked down the hall, the sound of her quiet sobs trailing behind me. In the solitude of the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on the dresser, a snapshot of us on our wedding day, all smiles and hope. I felt an ache deep in my chest, not just for what we had lost, but for what was about to come. Because as I lay down, fully clothed and too tired to undress, I knew that this was just the beginning of the end. The next day, I left for work before Molly woke up. The office was buzzing, the usual energy pulsing through the hallways. But as I walked past Nick's office, our eyes met briefly. He offered a nod, a casual acknowledgement, as if he hadn't helped dismantle the life I'd built. My hands clenched, but I forced myself to keep walking. I reached my office, shut the door, and took a deep breath. My phone buzzed on the desk, a message notification. It was from Rachel, hope today's a better day. I allowed myself a small, tired smile. Today wouldn't be better, not yet. But it was another day closer to the answers I needed, and the retribution I was starting to crave. The days turned into weeks, each one more strained than the last. Molly's attempts at reconciliation felt hollow, her words tinged with a desperation that only pushed me further away. I kept my distance, the guest room becoming more familiar than our shared bed. The house we had turned into a home now felt like a museum, its rooms echoing with memories that no longer felt like mine. At work, I became a shadow, moving from meeting to meeting, my interactions minimal. The only constant was Rachel's occasional check-ins and Nick's infuriatingly carefree demeanor. I spent my lunch breaks alone, staring at the skyline through my office window, wondering if peace would ever find its way back to me. One evening, when the winter sky was a canvas of bruised purples and grays, I came home to find the living room lit by the flicker of the fireplace. Molly sat on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed and tired, cradling a glass of wine. She looked up as I entered, the silence between us deafening. "Billy," she started, her voice raw, "I can't keep pretending that everything will fix itself. We need to talk." I hesitated, keys still in hand, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Finally, I nodded and sat across from her. The distance between us felt like miles. "I don't know how to make this right," she whispered. "I thought I could, but I'm realizing that maybe I've done too much damage." A heavy pause settled, broken only by the pop of a log in the fireplace. I stared at her, trying to read the woman I once knew so well. But the lines of her face, the quiver in her voice, everything felt foreign. My heart clenched, the last embers of anger flickering weakly before smoldering out. I had expected this moment, rehearsed my responses in the solitude of the guest room, but now that it was here, the words wouldn't come. "Maybe," I said finally, the word barely a whisper. "Maybe we can't fix this." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "I'm so sorry, Billy. For everything. For Nick, for lying, for making you doubt everything about us." The sound of his name sent a shiver through me, but the fury I expected didn't follow. Instead, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion, as if I'd been running a race with no finish line. "I know," I said, my voice breaking on the last word. "But sometimes sorry isn't enough." The silence wrapped around us, suffocating, final. Molly nodded slowly, understanding passing between us that words couldn't touch. She set down her glass and walked to the staircase, each step creaking as if groaning under the weight of her guilt. I stayed in the living room, staring at the flames that danced and cracked, their heat doing little to thaw the chill inside me. It wasn't until I heard the soft murmur of voices upstairs, Molly on the phone, that my ears pricked up. The tone was urgent, panicked. A few moments later, she rushed down the stairs, clutching her purse. Her eyes met mine, wide with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "I have to go. It's my sister. An emergency." Before I could respond, the front door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the glow of the dying fire. Hours passed. I dozed off on the couch, only to wake to the insistent ring of my phone. I groggily glanced at the screen, Rachel. "Billy," her voice was tight, almost unrecognizable. "Have you seen the news? There was an accident." The words cut through the fog in my mind. I sat up, adrenaline surging. "What accident?" "There was a crash on the highway. A pile-up. They said it involved a car like Molly's." Time stopped. The house, the warmth of the fire, even Rachel's voice on the other end, all of it blurred as I fumbled for the remote and turned on the news. The anchor's somber expression filled the screen as she described a multi-car collision on the interstate, vehicles mangled and twisted under the harsh glare of police lights. My heart hammered in my chest, the room spinning. I bolted to my feet and grabbed my keys, barely registering Rachel's voice calling my name as I hung up. The drive was a blur of lights and shadows, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, Molly's last expression, guilt-stricken and desperate, flashing in my mind. The hospital was chaos. The waiting room buzzed with the low hum of worried families, nurses moving swiftly past in a blur of scrubs and soft-soled shoes. I approached the reception, breathless. "Molly Harrison. Is she here?" The nurse glanced at her clipboard, sympathy darkening her eyes. "Are you family?" "I'm her husband," I said, the words catching in my throat. She nodded, motioning me to a chair. "A doctor will be out to speak with you soon." The minutes dragged by like hours until a doctor appeared, his face grave. "Mr. Harrison." I stood, my legs barely holding me up. "Is she?" He exhaled, and the look in his eyes answered everything. "She sustained significant injuries. We did everything we could, but," his voice trailed off, and the world around me collapsed into silence. The only sound left was the pounding of my heart and the echo of Molly's last words, "I'm so sorry, Billy." The doctor's voice was lost to the roar in my ears as I sank into the chair, numbness spreading through my limbs. The room spun, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger or pain. I felt the raw, unyielding weight of loss. The following days were a blur of condolences, arrangements, and faces that I barely recognized. Nick showed up at the funeral, standing at the back, his face pale and stricken. I couldn't bring myself to confront him, not with the suffocating reality of Molly's absence pressing down on me. The closure I thought I wanted, the retribution I had craved, it was all meaningless now. As I stood at her grave, the cold wind biting at my skin, I realized that the anger, the betrayal, and the pain had all been burned away, leaving only regret. Regret for the silence, for the words unsaid, for the moments lost to pride and fear. And as the first shovelful of earth fell onto her coffin, I whispered into the void, "I'm sorry too, Molly." But it was too late, the echo of those words lost in the wind.